In the late 80s and early 90s, the giant robot subgenre reigned supreme, enthralling audiences with awe-inspiring clashes between colossal machines capable of leveling entire cities, adding a layer of vulnerability that heightened the drama and fueled audience obsession. With the Nintendo Entertainment System dominating the home console market at the time, you'd expect a plethora of mech titles to capitalize on this craze. Popular mecha and giant robot series like Robotech, Transformers, and even GoBots boasted sizable fan bases in North America, fueled by the booming trend of giant robot anime that originated in Japan with Mazinger Z in 1972. Even Battletech, with its expanding universe across games, virtual reality, and television, was riding the mecha wave.
Like the Major always says,
information is ammunition.
Yet surprisingly, the NES never received official entries from Transformers, Robotech, GoBots, or Battletech, even despite the system being a hotbed for licensed games, sometimes for properties that just really didn't need a game. I mean, Yo-Noid made more sense than Hudson Hawk. Who was asking for a Hudson Hawk video game?
Can I ask you something?
sure.
Will you play Nintendo with me?
So, as you've probably guessed, as you are an intelligent person and you've likely clicked this video due to the title, I'm going to be running through what I call the Fateful 3 mech games that actually appeared on the NES. For this video, we'll be focusing exclusively on piloted mechs, leaving aside transformable suits and magically summoned behemoths, though the NES doesn't offer many of those anyway. You might notice I'm saying NES instead of Famicom. Since you're astute viewers, you've probably already deduced that we're solely exploring North American releases. While the Famicom had a slightly broader selection of mecha games, those will be potential topics for future videos. I'd also like to note that while Base Wars technically has mechs, it falls more into the sports genre in my book. Don't get me wrong, it looks fantastic and I might explore it in the future, but just not today. Also known as Metal Flame Psybuster in Japan, Metal Mech was developed by Sculpted Software and published by Jalico in 1991. Or was it Alico? Jalico? Jalico? I don't know how to say this, so I'm keeping it in. The Japanese version was released about a year earlier. In Metal Mech, you play as Tony Martin, whose mission is to destroy the Metal Mechs with a mech suit built of metal mechs. It will be no Sunday drive, apparently, as you stomp and mangle other metal mechs on your way to defeating their queen. And a shout out for my older audience members who still understand what a Sunday drive is. As a Japanese game ported to North American audiences, it's unsurprising that the story itself isn't present in the game, but rather in the manual. Back in the day, something as simple as a text crawl at the beginning or an intro like in the game Crystalis was a special feature. Additionally, the original Japanese version lacked an intro as well. However, in a rare instance, the North American version's opening screen is better than the Japanese counterpart. Visually, Metal Mech is one of the worst looking NES games I've ever played. Of the Fateful 3 mecha titles released on the Nintendo Entertainment System in North America, it's the only one that includes the reverse joint design seen in something like Macross or Battletech, but with 3 legs instead of 2. You won't notice this unless you look really closely. Levels are massive, sprawling 2D labyrinths with constantly repeating details and little variation in visual style. You probably don't expect to be slowly plodding through basic city areas and buildings, but that's pretty much all that Metal Mech has to offer. It has so little in the way of flair and detail that it's hard to actually say anything about it visually. I mean, look at the screen for yourself. Metal Mech is one of those games that was clearly changed during porting to make it more difficult for North American players, most of them centering around the rental market and the idea that more difficult games were rented more often because players needed the time to play them longer to get further. This might sound like a terrible idea nowadays, but in the days of rental store dominance, things were very different. And if you've ever watched a video on Battletoads, you already know all about it. Here, enemy speed and respawn rates have been cranked all the way up to the maximum. In Metal Flame, taking your time and moving forward step by step was a viable option. Not in the North American version. No matter where you are or what you're doing, expect to be relentlessly flanked by the small insectoid enemies and vehicles, all of which, I might add, are too small and too fast for the player mech to effectively handle itself. Leaving the mech and taking down some enemies can help, and it is an amazing feature for an NES game, but it leaves your vehicle exposed. Again, with the spawn rate and enemy speed in Metal Flame being more manageable, the act of leaving the mech behind and traversing a level, climbing its backgrounds and searching for switches and items is a lot more enjoyable. So if you absolutely want to play this game, I think the better option would be to pick up Metal Flame on the Famicom rather than Metal Mech on the NES. Originally appearing in arcades, Magmax was ported to the Famicom in 1986 and to the NES 2 years later. The game was developed by Nihon Busan, who had specialized in arcade games since 1978, releasing Magmax through their Nichibutsu publishing wing, with FIC releasing the game in North America. Between these two releases, Magmax also saw life on the Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, and Amstrad CPC. These versions all ported by Ocean and published by their very own Imagine label. The versions don't actually stop there. In 2015, the game would be released on PS4 through Arcade Archives and on the Nintendo Switch in 2020. That is a lot of versions, though I'm only going to be tackling the NES version today. Being an arcade game, Magmax is simple and straightforward fun. As an auto-scroller, the player begins as a small ship before collecting enough parts to become the eponymous Magmax. Though powerful, when hit, the player loses a part and must try their best to survive long enough to collect it again. Occasionally, there are variations in the color and functionality of a part, giving different or added benefits when the player collects them, but this mostly applies to the main weapon of the Magmax itself. What really changes up the experience is the game's genre-bending perspective changes. While dead simple in appearance, players are able to walk the ground as Magmax, battling enemies through an isometric perspective, or go through tunnels in order to enter underground areas, which play out in a space shooter side-scrolling style. Or I guess the other word is a shump. The game progresses across a large, seamless stage that varies the further the player goes. Eventually, a mechanical Hydra comes about as the game's boss character. What's the ultimate goal? Score, of course. So if that's your thing, it's here. Although I stand by the fact that scores mean just as little as today's achievement systems. And I'm sure to get a lot of comments about that. Oh, and there is a 2-player mode. I'd hope that this meant 2 Magmax units would be on screen, as the game seems perfectly suited for it. However, it's just hot seat multiplayer, which is great when you're young and playing with your siblings or friends, but it doesn't make for an interesting video section. What you see here is basically the multiplayer experience with one person. How does this version stack up against its arcade original? Well, I'd argue that it's a little more friendly. Playing the arcade version, I was impressed by the graphics, but it really is a quarter muncher. Firing is stiff to a fault, and in a game where firing is the primary function, that does make a difference. Although, do consider that these words are from a perspective of a person who plays an ungodly amount of games every day. Back when I was a kid and spent all of my spare money in laundromat arcades, I'd have gone nuts on this sort of game. I have to say that though it's graphically inferior, the Nintendo port is actually really good and maybe a little better when it comes to gameplay. I highly suggest it if you can get your hands on it. Or, find some alternative mean to get it. Not saying anything, but Though developed by the Japanese studio Tamex and published by fellow Japanese company Irem, Metal Storm was released first in North America, with the Japanese version coming a year later. The reason for this remains unclear. Despite being popular then and now, information about Metal Storm's history is scarce online. This is a problem with a lot of NES games, as they were made by extremely small teams. If a person doesn't feel like talking about their experience or the title's development history, or say, passed away, then there isn't anyone left to speak about it. Which is a shame because there's so much NES history that has just been lost with time, and it doesn't just apply to minor releases. More than just a simple shooter with a mech protagonist, Metal Storm elevates the experience with a gravity warping mechanic. The M308 gunner can spin mid-air, adhere to ceilings, and even dislodge non-stationary enemies. Every stage and boss encounter revolves around this innovative mechanic, maximizing its potential. While shooting certainly exists, Careful platforming and strategic thinking are crucial for progress. Run and gun tactics invariably lead to a quick demise, even against bosses. And speaking of bosses, Metal Storm throws in an incredibly diverse and creative lineup. They invoke memories of the Contra series, including its Probotector rebrand. While the levels themselves are undeniably fun and varied, the bosses truly incentivize players to push forward. However, even with technically infinite continues, expect them to test your patience and time, especially as the game progresses and the gravity mechanic becomes more prominent in these boss battles. Visually, Metal Storm stands out as one of the best looking NES games. Unlike Metal Mech's empty backgrounds, it boasts vibrant and detailed environments. The futuristic technological aesthetic avoids grimness and leverages the NES's color palette to create a visually impressive 8-bit Pluto-based setting. The game even pushes the NES's limits by experimenting with some scrolling backgrounds, though they are somewhat primitive in comparison to the Super Nintendo's Mode 7. There really isn't any surprise that Metal Storm is not only the best mech game on NES, but also one of the best games for the system, period. Retrobit apparently thought so as well, as they re-released the game in 2019. Both the standard and amazing collector's edition are sold out to this day. Had I not found out about this version so many years later, in 2004, as I was writing this script, I might have covered Metal Storm on the channel already. Forget giant robots at the NES launch in 1986. Rob the Gyromite was alone, even if you squint at robotish games like Robo Warrior, which was kind of a weird Bomberman clone. While Japan did see a mecha explosion in its media, and the West only got a handful of titles and shows to watch, even the Japanese library was lacking the variety fans craved. It's genuinely surprising how shy both NES and Famicom were with this popular genre. But what do you think? Why the lack of love on the NES? Did your childhood crave giant robots that just never arrived? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let's keep the conversation going.